So, what happens when you abduct your fiancé? A trigger warning for our listeners, this episode talks a little bit about sexual violence as well as rape. So if it's a topic that you don't want to hear about, do skip this episode. Thanks. Welcome to the Medieval Grad Podcast. It's a podcast brought to you by medievalists.net, where we chat with graduate students and early career researchers to learn about the new trends and the future of research in medieval studies. I'm Lucie Laumonier, a medieval historian and the podcast host. Today, we're talking with Chanelle Delameillieure, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Leuven in Belgium. Chanelle is currently a visiting scholar at Columbia in the United States. Hello, Chanelle. Thank you very much for being here.
Hello, Lucie. Thank you very much for having me.
So, Chanelle, you received your PhD in 2020 from the Catholic University of Leuven. Your dissertation's title is Contentious Consent, Abduction, Control over Marriage and Legal Strategy in the Late Medieval Low Countries. Tell us what got you interested in the Middle Ages and more specifically in history of marriage and family.
Oh, well, when I started studying history at university, I wasn't really interested in the Middle Ages. So I started with the idea that I would study contemporary history. But it was at the university that I was introduced to a medieval world that was much more sophisticated, I think, than I thought it would be, because I had a very cliched image in my head of the Middle Ages with crusades and horrible bloodshed and all these wars. So I was very happy to learn at university that there were huge, important societies with very colorful inhabitants, with very sophisticated ways of settling conflicts. And then with regard to family and marriage history, I think it started only in my master's year when I had to find a topic to write my master's dissertation. And I stumbled upon very odd sources, like it were declarations of consent, like registrations of women who went to the local authorities of the cities in the Low Countries, and they said, I came here to say that I went with this man by choice, and everything he did to me was with my consent. So this was amidst of all the Me Too and consent stuff that was going on or was starting back then. So for me, it was so fascinating that I saw these records, and I decided to study them, and I haven't stopped since.
That's a great story. So I read the title of your dissertation and you already mentioned records of consent. So let's start from there and from the beginning. In the early Middle Ages, the church had little leverage on marital law. But in the course of the 11th and 12th century, the church power and influence grew tremendously. Theologians elaborated a complex doctrine on marriage. And from that point, the idea of solus consensus, or consent alone, emerged in canon law. Consent alone means that to be married, a man and a woman only had to freely consent to marry each other. Could you explain what it means and the repercussions on marriage and families?
Yes, so I think it's a very important part of this medieval history, this whole idea of consent, because in the 12th century, the church, as you said, made consent very central in marital law. So consent really became like the backbone of marriage. And what's special is that the exchange of words of consent by a future husband and a future wife in itself, this exchange of words constituted a marriage. So it was through speaking the right words that you could get married to someone. Now, whether this really changed how people got married in the 12th century or in the centuries thereafter is a very difficult question, one that has been debated a lot, I think, for the last few decades. Yeah, I cannot give a very clear answer, but on the one hand, we see indeed that people knew about these rules in the late medieval Low Countries. We see that they use these narratives on consent, on coercion and stuff like that. So they really knew these laws and these rules, and they used them in court. But on the other hand, there is a lot of evidence, and I also found a lot of evidence that a lot of men and women still married strategically, that the family mattered very much. So it's difficult to give a very straightforward question. Also because, as for example, scholars like Shannon McSheffrey have said, we have to be a bit careful that we don't paint a too dual image of, on the one hand, these very strategic families, and on the other hand, these very emotional young people in love who want to marry a partner that they choose themselves. Probably the reality wasn't like that. Nevertheless, I think that the fact that the consent was enshrined in law for the first time so broadly was very meaningful because it at least had the possibility, I think, for young men and young women especially to be in charge of their own lives and be in charge of their own bodies. And some of them probably or certainly will have made use of this new focus on consent. But in the 13th century, we indeed see that the Church issued some extra stipulations, for example, at the Fourth Council of Lateran in 1215. And these stipulations were really targeted or meant to make the marriage public or to increase the marriage visibility. So there were rules like, for example, a priest had to be involved, marriages had to be announced in advance so people from the community could raise possible impediments and stuff like that. And these extra stipulations were necessary in order to make a valid marriage also legal. So it's a bit complex, but actually, if you married after these rules were issued based on consent, your marriage was valid and nobody could break the marriage. But if you did not take into account these extra rules, then the marriage was illegal. So you could be punished for entering into marriage without taking into account these rules set forward by the Church.
So what kind of punishment were placed on these valid but not legal marriages?
When you look at the laws are very strict. The few laws that I've looked at, they say people have to be excommunicated. But in practice, or the records that I looked at, often indeed these people had to pay a fine and they had to convert their illegal marriage into a legal marriage by taking care of all these measurements or all these extra rules within a given period of time. So yeah, in fact, it wasn't a very, very severe punishment. It was indeed paying the fine and making sure that you would have this proper celebration.
Mm. And I think that I know that also in the 12th century there was a lot of debate within the Church about the place of the role of consummation, so having sex, the intercourse, in establishing the validity of a marriage.
Yes, so indeed, there was a lot of discussion about that. There were actually two ways of getting married. So on the one hand, it was exchanging words of present consent, saying, yes, I marry you now, or I do. And that was it. But on the other way, you could also marry through words of future consent. And this meant that you would say, okay, I will take you as my wife in the future, or I will take you as my husband, which then counted as a sort of engagement, you could say. And then it was the consummation that transformed this engagement or the betrothal into an actual marriage. And when we see that in England, in medieval England, it were especially these marriages with words of present consent that were dominant. In the Low Countries, these marriages through words of present consent were extremely rare. So all the clandestine marriages that I see in church court records here were marriages entered into through promises of a marriage in the future and then the consummation of the marriage.
So this is a segue, but we'll take it.
Okay.
I'm familiar with the work of Shannon McShiffry and also her consistory database. So it's a database of cases in England, and a lot were concerned with marriage. And we see that sometimes that there were some young men who would promise to marry a woman, apparently maybe to just have sex with them. And then the women said, well, we are married. And they were saying, no, we are not. Do you see that kind of cases in the Low Countries?
Yes, I see a lot of these cases, and it's a bit frustrating to see it. So it's almost always the woman indeed saying that he had promised to marry me. And then often in the records that I use, they include like the testimony of the woman. And I have one where the woman says, well, but we had sex indeed, but he has said that he would take me as his wife within a half of a year or within a year at maximum. So it was this promise he had made, apparently, according to her. And she said, well, it was a promise plus sex. It meant that a marriage had been made. But in reality, when there wasn't evidence of the fact that a promise had been made, it was easy for one of both parties to deny the fact that these words had been said. And then indeed, we have a lot of these cases where women go to the court saying that this had happened to them. Often they don't succeed at having the marriage acknowledged, but they do receive like a sum for losing their virginity, like a sort of compensation, you could say.
And are you aware of the cases where it's the other way around, where the man wants to marry and the woman doesn't?
Yes, these are especially cases that I looked at, because it's often an abduction that preceded these cases. So I have several cases, or I've studied several cases in which men go to the court as a plaintiff saying, well, I am married to that woman, I have abducted her with her consent, so I have seducted her, we exchanged words of consent, we had sex, which was in Low Countries an important additional element of proof, and now she got married to another man and she refuses to join our marital house. And then I have the story of the woman as a defendant saying, well, it's just not true, I was abducted violently, I exchanged consent under pressure, so it doesn't count as consent, and we didn't have sex. So all these different legal elements were ticked off, you could say. And then indeed, we often see that the woman wins here and that the husband or that the man doesn't succeed at having this marriage validated or acknowledged by the church.
It's so entertaining.
I agree.
History of the family, and the sources are just incredible. Okay, segue over.
Okay.
But I think the transition is there, because my question started with, your dissertation looks more specifically at abduction cases, and you just mentioned abduction. So at first glance, abduction seems very contrary to the idea of consent. However, you argue that in some cases, these abductions were consented and more like elopements. So could you explain how abduction was construed back then in the Low Countries?
Yes, so consent in abduction cases was crucial. And the problem is that I use the word abduction in English to talk about these cases, but in the medieval Dutch records that I use, or the Flemish records, but also in modern Dutch, there is a very specific word, schaak or schaking, and this specifically means the seizure of women for the purpose of marrying them, with or against their will. And this phenomenon cannot be easily translated. There is no exact English equivalent. So in my dissertation, I used abduction, although it might seem odd, I think, for native speakers that I talk about consensual abductions.
Yeah, because abduction, I think it evokes the idea of someone taking someone else by force, maybe by night, putting them like in a bag and running away. So yeah.
Yes, and often it was like that. But actually, I should talk about like abduction with marital intent, with or against the will of the woman. And if it was with the will of the woman, it was often against the will of her families. And this is why it was criminalized. But consensual and violent abductions were two different judicial categories. So one was a much worse crime than the other. And they had a different legal outcome often. So therefore, in almost all cases, we see judges trying to determine whether the abduction was with or against the will. And then there are all kinds of evidence. People bring up different kinds of evidence. For example, someone had heard her cry, which was a sign that it was against her will. Another one said, but I saw she was smiling, which was a sign it was with her will. So this was really like the question in court, was it with or against her will? And that's why it's a very central concept in my dissertation. And indeed, some historians have argued that a lot of these consensual abductions were in fact elopements in disguise or seduction. I think we should be very careful in making that conclusion, because what I found out when looking at these consensual abductions is that a lot of cases that were reported as being consensual weren't far from what we would consider consensual today. They weren't cases of free will or consent. And the reason for that is that, in a lot of cases, women consented or agreed to marry their abductor, although they did not initially wanted to go with him. It's a bit like with rape in the Middle Ages. It's awful if we look at it today. But back then, it was a logical or a frequent solution for the perpetrator and the victim to get married because of ideas about honor and sexuality. So a lot of these cases were labeled as consensual because it wasn't useful. The judge often says it doesn't make sense to punish it now because the couple is married, and then they were labeled as consensual. But it's not a matter of free choice or love or will as we would perceive it today.
Could you tell us one of these stories?
There is one very, very interesting, I think, about a woman from Antwerp, which is a city in the Duchy of Brabant, and she had made arrangements with a man's father about a marriage with him. But I don't know what happened, but apparently some of the arrangements that had been made in advance were called off, and she didn't want the marriage anymore. And then we see that the son of the dad who she talk to, he went to her house and abducted her. And then the judge says, well, this was partly with and partly against her consent, which really shows the struggle of these judges, I think. What do we have to do with these cases? And what you also see sometimes is verdicts in which it is said, like, okay, she was abducted against her will. We heard her crying, but eventually she was satisfied. So she married her, and there is no sense at all in punishing this case, because her consent changed, you could say, and she agreed to marry him, and she was happy with him, and they are still together. So this is the very old narratives on how this consent was not a fixed thing, but it could change, it could evolve, and it made it very difficult in a lot of cases for judges, to label these cases.
I'm assuming that as you mentioned already, that the presence of witnesses was really the central point to get a testimony through, because it's a lot of, I guess, he said, she said, in that kind of situations.
Yeah, it's indeed a lot of he said, she said, and that's the big frustration that I have, is that for Low Countries we don't have any depositions from witnesses. So we see it indirectly, indeed, that people were questioned, or that accomplices said, oh, I thought it was with her consent and stuff like that, or that the judge really tries to look for people who had heard the outcry of the victim. But this was indeed essential. Try to find visible proof or elements that could indicate this idea of consent or the lack of consent, which was very tricky and is still very tricky today, I think.
Yeah. How frequent were these abductions?
That's a challenging question because I use legal records, and in these legal records, cases have been registered that were dealt with in a court, or in which authorities intervened in some way or another. I have studied a few private contracts, and therein I can see that a lot of families, it was a very delicate matter, and a lot of families preferred dealing with these matters privately. So they made private settlements, which was a huge way of conflict settlement in the Low Countries in the late Middle Ages. So I only can count the cases that ended up in court. And here it's difficult. For some years, I don't have any cases. And for other years, I have 6 cases in one city. For example, in another court, in the court of the Diocese of Cambrai, which was where Brussels and Antwerp lay, there were 96 cases of abductions in a decade, or a bit more than a decade. But then in another church court, I found none. So probably this is an issue of registration, I only have final verdicts. So often in these final verdicts from church courts, probably the abduction wasn't mentioned because it didn't really matter. It was the marriage that was discussed. So that makes it difficult. And that's why I have opted to cast a wide net to find sources. I have looked at different courts, different cities, ecclesiastical courts, but also secular courts. And this made it easier for me to find material. And also I think that it showed, or that I thought, that this was more of a problem than historians have acknowledged until now. Because indeed, in some years, I found a lot of these abductions. I studied a lot of legal texts showing that these abductions or marriage without parental consent were a real issue. Sometimes I have one family where a few women were abducted. So like the aunt and the mother and the daughter entered into marriage through abduction. So it's odd. And for that families, at least, it must have been a very well-known thing, which people talked about, which people knew about. So I think it was more of an issue, or more of people were more familiar with it than has often been assumed.
Is it a good question to ask, why did this abduction happen? Or
for me, the reason always is to force a marriage which wasn't possible in normal circumstances. So abductors, also their families were often involved. They try to force a marriage, and thereby they force themselves into a circle or into a family. And it was a gate that they normally wouldn't have access to. And abduction was a tool to break open that gate and to take a wife that would lead to perhaps a social promotion, to connections, to good families. And in most of these cases, we can really see indeed that these marriages were often wealthy daughters, I don't know how to say it in English, like daughters from without siblings who had a lot of property that they would inherit from their parents. So the financial aspect of it, but also it's not only financially, it's also socially, like the effect of reputation, that played a very strong role. it is, of course, possible that some people married for love. A lot of people said in the sources that they did this for love and that it had nothing to do with wealth or money. It is possible, indeed. It's always difficult to prove, of course, because we cannot look inside of these people's heads. But the fact that a lot of these abductions were perpetrated not by one person, but by a chief perpetrator who was assisted by his nephews, his father, his mother sometimes, indicates to me that it was often a matter of trying to fix a very strategic, smart marriage.
And what do the court records, what do they leave out?
Yes.
What are the kind of information that you would wish you had and you don't have?
What I miss the most, I think, from this is the dynamics between or within the families, both between and within the families, because there are several clues that the abductor and the abductee, they were part of a clan, of a group of people. And I think that there are several clues that these people were involved in the abduction, in the way the abduction was settled, but only very, very, very few times we get access to these people. And in these legal records, it's always presented as if it was only about the abductor and the abductee. It was the abductor versus the abductee, or the abductor and the abductee versus the family. But also within the family, there were a lot of discussions about how the situation should be dealt with. And I think that these dynamics are very, very interesting. And I was very, it frustrated me indeed a little bit that I didn't have access to it. I try to compensate for that by looking into private contracts, into private settlements made within families. And there sometimes you can see like discussions within the family where, like, for example, the father of the abductee agreed to settle the thing and be in peace with what had happened, while other relatives, for example, relatives of the mother, said, no, we don't agree. We want to sue. We want to make a case out of this. And that's really interesting, these family dynamics. I wasn't able to look at that as much as I would have wanted to.
Okay. Before we conclude, let's just talk very briefly about the outcomes. So you said that, the court's decision depended on a lot of factors. Do you have information on what happened after? And what happened when the court said this marriage is not valid? So it was annulled. And do you have sources about, what happened to these couples afterwards?
And sometimes we have sources. But the problem is that there are always case studies. Like, I cannot make very general claims. And also the cases that I have information about are always cases that I think are atypical because they ended up in court a few times. And there are indeed a few women and their marriage to their abductor that they did not want to was acknowledged. So the church decided, well, at the moment you exchange consent, it was real consent. And they end up trying to fight this. It's very rare, but I have, for example, one case where one woman said, well, I don't agree. I don't want to join my husband in a marital home. She was locked up in prison.
Oh, wow.
And she kept on fighting, trying to have him sued for like rape and everything. She kept on fighting for 14 years, trying to annul her marriage to her abductor. And it worked out in the end because she heard, when she finally was tired of battling, she went to join her husband in his house, so they would live together. And there she heard that her late mother had an affair with her husband, which is as juicy as it can get. And that's a reason for the church to annul the marriage, because it's like a sort of incest by affiliation, something like that. So she succeeded and the marriage was annulled and she married another man. But it's pretty exceptional, and it's crazy that that all the records have been found by a Flemish historian who worked on that case. But these are like crazy cases that show that these women could really take control. She suffered a lot for it, but in the end, she was successful and she got rid of her husband. Sometimes we also see like people who seem to have taken up a normal position in society, like, okay, they were a couple, they took part in daily life, they had a high position in the city, and it seems as if nothing had happened. We also see that. And sometimes you see people getting a separation after a few years. So it's the question is it because of the abduction? Maybe it was a very unhappy marriage indeed. In low countries, you could get separated because you couldn't get along. It was a reason in low countries for people to separate. Sometimes you see that, but there are only a few cases, which makes it, for most of the couples that I see, it's guessing to how their life would have been after the abduction.
No. Well, that was very interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
That was Chanelle Delameillieure, a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Leuven in Belgium, and you can find out more about her work in the show notes. Stay with us because the episode isn't over yet. Let's bring in Peter Konieczny from medievalist.net. Hi, Peter, how are you? What did you think of the interview?
Well, I think I'm doing good, and I think Chanel is taking on what I think is a very tricky topic, right? And I think it's in part because it's confusing for all us historians looking about these records because it was confusing for the people who lived at the time, right?
Yeah.
Um, like matters of love and marriage tend to be complicated, so it's not surprising that like we kind of see all this back and forth about what are the rules, right? So yeah, like it's really cool that she's kind of working in and trying to see all the kind of different patterns and what people are trying to do, but it's an awfully big challenge.
Yes, definitely. And I think she really talks very well about that there's so much we don't know. It's always so frustrating because these kind of archives, especially judiciary, they at first glance come off as so lively, full of details, but the more you look into them, the more you realize that you actually don't know much and that it's kind of lively, yes, at the first glance, but so many details are lacking. One standpoint is never there. You're
Yeah.
always wondering, but what were the parents wanting or doing? And as you said, plus there's this issue of the law, the families, she said, he said. There were a lot of feelings, obviously. So it's very complicated, and also honor to uphold the family's reputation. So it's very complex.
Yeah, like she's working through court records, and those can be so challenging because you tend to get the first of all the legalese, which is what people don't say, like in fact, but that's how it gets it reinterpreted in the court records.
Yeah.
But you also get like abbreviated versions of what's going on. Like you wish, like, oh man, I wish they would tell us more, like, or give us more viewpoints, or all the witnesses, or things like that. Like, so it's so you're often working with a bit of a hand tied behind your back and trying to interpret these texts.
Yeah, and I think it's also very interesting that Chanel is tackling this challenge for the Low Countries because there is a lot of literature also for the rest of Europe, such as England, the north of France, for instance.
Yeah, she specifically mentions the work being done by Shannon McSheffrey, who's out in McGill, I believe.
No, she's at Concordia. I sometimes
Oh,
collaborate with her. Yeah,
oh, okay. Well, that's they're close,
it's
right?
Montreal. It's the
All
same.
right.
It's fine.
So, and so she's done a few books. One is called like Love and Marriage in Medieval London, and it's this collection of different cases. And I think we have a bit on our website about it, but they're really fascinating kind of ways to see what's happening there in London. So it's good to see these kind of comparisons. But yeah, like that, and oh, I've got this great tale on medievalist.net about well, kind of like a adultery case out of in Renaissance Florence, and
Mm.
this was like oh, it's so juicy.
Tell us more.
So oh, this is like the father of the of Machiavelli's. This is his dad writing in his like kind of family like ledger book,
Okay.
uh, uh, and it is one of his nephews is having an affair with his one of his own maids,
Okay.
and like this gets all found out when she gets pregnant, and like his writing in it, like of explaining all that is happening, and like how much disdain he has for this nephew of his, and how he just wanted the world to know that his nephew was a jerk. That's
Okay, well, I think we all need to read that particular article on the website.
oh tales of love are always the most tricky.
Yeah, I recently published a paper about a very, very, also very, very juicy adultery story from the area near Toulouse in the south of France. And same, a lot of details, a lot of unknowns, and just we have to deal with that and work around all the details that are lacking from all these cases.
Wow, that's the fun part of doing history.
Yeah, that's true.
Thanks again for doing the episode.
Thank you, Peter. Bye.
Bye.
You were listening to the Medieval Grad podcast brought to you by medievalists.net. If you want to support us and this podcast, you can subscribe to our Patreon, patreon.com/medievalists. You can get a lot of neat benefits on Patreon, including being able to hear the episodes early. We love doing this show and we really appreciate your help. I'm Lucie Laumonier. You can find me on Instagram at The French Medievalist, and you can look me up on academia.edu. Thank you for tuning in. Au revoir.